Hey, everybody, welcome back to Inside the Matrix. Today I am joined by one of my favorite humans, Benjamin Balderson. And every time I either talk with him or see him on a show, I learn something, or I learn a whole bunch of stuff. So, as an alchemist, I mean, this guy has got so many talents. I'd be here all day trying to explain it to you. But anyway, I just want to bring in Benjamin. How are you, sir?
Oh, fantastic, Jimmy. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing great. So happy to have you back. It's been a long time since we talked, and I looked it up. I think it's almost been 2 years, and I can't imagine how it
Well,
went by that
I think
fast.
I was on with James True, and him and I came on a little bit over a year ago. I think it was
Yeah, it's
just, and then it was me by myself like a year before that. And I specifically remember I was actually at a Renaissance festival while it was
that's
going
right.
on, and
That's
yeah,
right.
that was a
Yeah,
good time.
awesome, awesome. And then since then, you've done so many great shows. You have your own channel these days, and you're everywhere, which is great because people need to hear what you have to say. So let's talk about something that you recently have brought forward with Crow 777 and a few others, the biochemical universe. And
Yeah,
let's just talk about that.
absolutely, absolutely. So a couple years ago, after I'd been on Crow, a guy named LC King got a hold of me, and he has a show now, but he didn't at the time. And he was approaching the world as a battery, and he was trying to figure out the astrology. And some of the things that he said to me were just shocking, and I was like, wow. Um, but we needed to flesh the whole thing out. So he wanted me to help with alchemy and with the different cosmology knowledge that I have, things like that. So for the last couple of years, him and I have been working on this universe model of understanding the way our world actually works. Now, one of the first things that you have to understand with that is as an alchemist, all the wandering stars are associated with a metal because they are that metal. So when you start looking at the wandering stars, then you've got gold for the sun, silver for the moon, Mars is iron, Venus is copper, Jupiter is tin, Uranus is aluminum, or actually, the funny thing, I think that's actually should be uranium. And whenever that's one that I've been kind of investigating, because then also when you go look at a uranium reactor, it's always called a uranium aluminum reactor. And I was like, oh, well, now that's extra interesting. But that's something I haven't fully finished working out. But anyways, um, and Saturn's lead. So when you start looking at this as a battery, with a battery, we're going to start out with just the galvanic cell. And a galvanic cell has a cathode, which is going to be your positive, an anode, which is going to be your negative, and the anode is going to be slightly less stable or able to degrade more than the positive, because when the battery's running, this is going to need to degrade. Now, then there's also a salt bridge that connects these two, and then a mercurial solution or an electrolytic solution that they float in, that the actual electrodes are floating in. Now, your cathode would be the sun, your anode would be the moon, and then the other luminaries would be your plates that are in between these two things. So, when this thing is functioning as a battery, as it is now, what you have is, and here's another thing that we've been working on, and it's absolutely fascinating, is that they've reversed that the moon is masculine and the sun is feminine. And through the Abrahamic traditions, they've reversed that completely. When you start looking at any of the older cosmologies, then you can see that we understood this at one point in time. As a heathen, the sun is feminine and the moon is masculine. And there's a specific interactions that happen because of this. Uh, With Egyptian, that's another very popular one. The moon is actually Osiris. And all kinds of people since then, the Abrahamic tradition started coming in, started switching that, trying to make that switch and calling the moon feminine. But Osiris is the moon itself. And Osiris gets cut into 14 pieces, which is the waning moon. And then Isis goes and reassembles him, which is the waxing moon. The 14 pieces come back together, and that's the 14 days and 14 days of the cycle, except for his penis, which she keeps and impregnates herself with over and over and over. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Good
that's
times. Good
yeah, that's
times.
always fun.
Right. He was dead, but he was still having a good time. Like, uh, so, and like, if you look at Native American traditions, like the First Nation people in Canada, they actually would, women, if you wanted to make sure you conceived and got pregnant, you exposed your genitals to the full moon specifically. And there's a reasoning behind all of this. So the moon is actually the masculine side or the negative side, and the sun then would be the cathode or the positive side. And the way a galvanic cell works then is the negative side, a particle will split. And when that particle splits, the negative side jumps through that bridge and goes right over to the cathode directly. And this is your masculine negative energy. Well, that's going to create a small charge. As you can see, this cell splitting is going to create a charge, and this is a fission charge. And so we're going to get a little bitty charge that's going to happen. Well, now the negative is going to race over to the cathode, and the positive side or the ion side is going to float around in this electrolytic solution. Now the cathode is going to change charge slightly because it just gained some negative charge. So now that actually changes the overall charge of the cathode. Now, because it's got that heavier negative charge, now that little positive ion is going to float its little way over there, and because it's being drawn, and inside the solution, it's going to actually fuse with that cathode again. And so the thing that was the anode, where this particle was a silver piece over in the anode, when this fusion happens, this now becomes gold. And so an actual transmutation has happened between these two electrodes. And when the fusion charge happens, that's a giant charge comparative to the fission charge, where this thing's actually becoming part of this other electrode. And then that energy is released, and that's when it's usable, and we can actually use this energy. Now, when it was breaking apart in this mercurial solution, when the breaking apart was happening, that was happening through an oxidation. And we all understand the way oxygen, well, not everybody understands, but we'll talk about it. So oxygen, whenever you're looking at it, anytime an energetic reaction is going to happen, what oxygen is doing is removing the roadblock. So if we take something like a simple wood fire, the oxygen doesn't actually burn. In those things where everybody thinks oxygen's explosive and burns, oxygen does not. Now, what will happen though is the fire that's burning, the oxygen needs to remove that carbon that's building up in there and being released in order for that fire to keep going. Or else that carbon is going to dampen it, and it's going to blanket the fire and smother it. In your body, you don't use glucose. That's not an energy cell. It needs to be decarbonated. So that carbon molecule needs to be taken out in order to turn it into ATP. So that way you can use ATP as pure energy. So in order to do that, you need to get as much oxygen in your system in order to get all that carbon out that you're trying to burn away in order to make this energetic conversion. So in all levels, this is the same thing that's happening. With a plant, when you take THC, you go to a cannabis plant, you pick the bud off and you eat it, it won't do anything for you. You have to decarbonate that THC in order to make that active, in order to make that work. So always with this decarbylation is an oxygen molecule coming in and grabbing it. That's what the oxygen's job is doing, is being a vehicle for this carbon in and out. Now, on the other side, you have your hydrogen molecule, and the hydrogen is what's making this fusion reaction happen. So when you're looking at the hydrogen, that's actually allowing this ion and this electron to come back together. And you can see examples of that in George Weissman, who's been making rounds now, who's just absolutely fantastic. He has this Brown's gas machine, and he started out with the Brown's gas machine, which is just a hydrogen splitting machine. His is a little bit nicer. It doesn't use a membrane, so he's building up a structured water membrane, and then it's carrying an extra electron. So because of the way his system's doing this, when he originally used it to make welders, and when it's welding, this welder would actually melt steel, melt titanium, anything like that at 270 degrees, which is less than what your Bic lighter is throwing out.
Yeah, and that seems
Absolutely.
amazing. I heard about Brown's gas, I think in the 90s, and it just there's so much to that. But yeah, keep going.
Absolutely. And it's amazing. And it doesn't make sense. So to understand that, we need to understand that we're just getting a transfer of energy, and it's just changing forms. And there's certain variances to the way things are going to do that. Like most people think water boils at what, 212 degrees, I think.
Hmm.
Um, but that's not true. Water boils at this approximate atmospheric pressure at 212 degrees. If you go up in the mountains, it boils at less. If you go down towards sea level, it boils at more. If I put that water inside my vacuum chamber and I pull out all the atmospheric pressure, the water will boil at less than room temperature and will just start boiling itself off. So when the metal is changing into its liquid form, all you're doing is getting more electrons in there, more energy in there. And this hydrogen is allowing that transition of these negative particles to go inside of this metal, where before they had to work really hard to get inside there. That's why you needed all that heat. Heat is just wasted energy that's just dissipating out into the atmosphere. Now we're directing that with this little hydrogen tunnel, and that hydrogen's opening the path up. So these negative particles are just flying right into the metal. So without the heat, the extra electrons are able to be placed inside of this metal. And now it's turning liquid because now it's got this abundance of extra energy. And that's what causes your different transitions. If you give it a little more heat, a little more energy, it's going to vaporize, and that's going to turn into gas. Give it a little bit more, it's going to go into a plasma level. So that's all we're talking about with these transitions is how much energy, how much chaotic energy is inside of this material. And with this hydrogen, it's allowing that to go in without the resistance. It's taking away all the resistance to allowing that energy to get inside of the particular metal. Now, inside of a battery, it's doing the same thing. It's allowing that to go together and fuse together. And this is what mercury's job is. So many people don't understand that what mercury is, but mercury is the messenger. It's the crossroads, the transition. And so what mercury's doing is it's allowing these transitions to happen. And we're talking about philosophical mercury right now, not the metal mercury, although the metal mercury does work in the same way. And there are batteries that are operated off of mercury. Now, but what we're talking about is over here was the negative side of the mercury. The oxygen was acting as the negative side because it ripped this apart and took this energy from here and moved it over here. Now, once it got over here, it allowed that transition to happen into this other thing. And it gave this to the other side. Now, if we flip around and turn this into an electrolysis event, which is recharging the battery, that whole process just flips. So we understand that that's why part of why mercury doesn't have, it's always androgynous. things like that. It's not either the positive or the negative, but it's allowing the transition between the two to happen, which is what needs to happen. If you don't have that transition between the two polarities, then you don't have energy, you don't have life. It's that exactly that those two polarities and their strength, and then the ability to transition between the two, that gives us life and energy. Whenever you're looking at a heart monitor, that dead center line, that's dead. That's dead center. And you go from all way up to way down, way up to way down. So you're riding on both sides of this polarity in order to achieve life. That's going to apply in every level. How are we doing so far, Jimmy?
Oh, that's great. But for those of us who are cosmologically challenged, let's talk about how this fits into actual cosmology that, most people relate to the world as they've been, programmed to think that we're living on a spinning ball globe out there and we're hurtling through space, we're spinning at 1,000 miles an hour and all this stuff that you and I both know is nonsense. So let's, if you
Absolutely.
can relate what you just said, the system, the cosmological system that we're talking about is basically a battery. Let's talk about what that looks like. Like my idea of our cosmology is that we live on a basically flat plane, not taking into account that we have mountains and valleys and things like that, but we're basically on a flat plane and we have some kind of a barrier or container above us, whether this is a hard physical dome or energetic, we don't know. But let's
Mm-hmm.
relate that to what you're saying as this system that we live in being a battery.
Absolutely. So obviously, being a battery, it needs to be enclosed. And when we're looking at this, so I also agree 100% with the that we live on a flat plane. But it's a little more complicated also because we live in the cosmic egg and we're on the flat plane inside that egg. Now, that's the carbon plane is what I like to call it. And as soon as we get above the carbon plane, all of a sudden things are still there. The same elements are still there. The oxygen's still there that was on the carbon plane as water. The hydrogen's still there. All those things are there. They've just become more energetic. They've raised. So now we're up into the airplane and there's multiple levels and layers of that, but that's all still part of our world. We're able to touch that and be in it. That's part of our world. That's just not a part where we can stand on it. Like now, if you get below us, that's more dense than what we know how to deal with. If we go down and try living down there, anybody that lives without the sunlight and gets away from the sunlight, you start having vitamin D deficiencies, you start getting illnesses, depression, all kinds of problems, because we're meant to live right on this level, but that level below us still exists. It's not like we live on a piece of paper.
Right.
We can dig miles and miles down. So what we understand then is when we're looking at it, we've got the electrodes of the battery hanging out above us in this solution. And that's your etheric or your energetic part. And then underneath us is this crystal bridge. Okay. And we all know that you start digging down into the soil and get underneath that soil, you're going to find all kinds of quartz like mad. Just the entire inside of the earth is just massively lined with quartz. So that's your quartz level where things are really structured, as opposed to where we live on this weird carbon level. Now, the interesting thing about the carbon level and about this entire battery then, so we understand that we're basically living above the crystal bridge, but underneath the electrodes. We're living in the electrolytic fluid. So now, as this battery operates, the moon, as each of these particles breaks off and fuses with the sun, we can see that there's an electrical wearing that's going to happen. And the moon is actually going to get smaller, as are the other luminaries. And eventually the system's going to wear down and degrade. And what happens when electrical systems start wearing down? Your apps don't work as well. My drill doesn't have half the strength that it used to have. I can't even drive the same bolts. You start noticing all these problems. Some weird things start happening, like just real glitchy things. You're like, I didn't even push that button. Why did it type B 6 times? I don't understand. And these are just weird electrical things. So in almost every cosmology that is out there, there's always what I'm going to refer to as a Ragnarok event, because I'm a heathen. And in this Ragnarok event, what happens is Surt and his fire armies come riding down from Muspelheim. And he drives his sword through all the 9 worlds and burns everything to ash. On the other side, then meets the armies of Niflheim, which is the ice giants. And then it washes the whole thing over with water. And then everything comes back green and all the plants are huge. There's fruits and grains that no man sowed because everything's super fertile. The battery has been recharged. Now, one of the very interesting things about looking at that electrolysis process then is there's a few things that are going to come up. Is as soon as I start putting power into that cathode, which is what that electrical event just described, is throwing just a ton of power into there, the first thing that's going to do is break apart everything that's there. Because when a battery starts wearing away like that and starts becoming bad, what's happening is it's losing its polarization. The lead crystals are actually attaching themselves to the plates and to the electrodes. And that needs that hard charge to come back in there and knock that down and create that polarity, that differential between the two. Because all power runs off a differential. It doesn't matter whether it's hot and cold, whether it's positive and negative. It's always this differential is where you're drawing power from. So while this is happening, then the power is getting thrown into the cathode, and the cathode is actually breaking apart and will actually send pieces of itself over to the anode and to these other plates as it breaks apart, and these grow and it recharges the whole system and resets and rebalances it. So now the funny thing about this Brown's gas machine then was this is just straight an electrolysis machine. And if you go talk to George and you listen to George's story, one of the things that ends up happening, and there's a few arguments about these Brown's gas machines. A lot of people are try to say that it's getting the hydrogen from the salt, which is really funny because the salt that they're putting in is a lie, and that's a 14 base. And pH, when you're looking at water or any liquid like that, what pH stands for is potential of hydrogen. And so the acid side is extremely hydrogenated, and it's only able to take in one hydrogen. It's already full of hydrogen. It's hydrogenated. And so that makes it hydrophobic. It doesn't want to take in hydrogen. On the opposite side, you've got lye, or your base, because 7 is dead neutral, 1 is acidic, 14 is base. Base means you don't have hydrogen, and that really wants to grab hydrogen. It wants to pull that and grab it really bad. So, and people are like, oh, I'm getting it out of the salt. Well, the other thing about this is while you're running the machine, if you don't put any contaminants inside the machine, you never add salt. There's only 2 components ever getting added to this system while it's being electrolyzed: distilled water and electricity, just straight electricity. It's using up both those 2 things. Well, funny thing is eventually it starts building up this sludge, and the sludge matches the metal of the electrodes and the plates. because he's not using it as a battery, so he doesn't need that differential for that chemical breakdown. He's just throwing in straight power. So it's all the same metal, and this metal's matching this sludge that's developing. And so your first thought is that is that these plates are breaking down. Well, for 3 years, they cleaned out this sludge and kept it. And over a 3-year period, he ends up with 19 pounds of this sludge, which is a substantial amount. So he
Wow.
takes apart, right, substantial. So he takes apart this machine and weighs the electrodes and the plates, and they still weigh the same.
Oh,
There
so
is no
where does it come from?
right. So this is just some magic sludge, right? And the only other thing that's getting fed into the machine is distilled water. This electrolysis process is causing this sludge to appear in a in this liquid level, in this electrolytic fluid level where we live. So every time that a Ragnarok event happens, and when you're looking at that, it's not the end of the world, it's the recharging of the battery. And every time that cycle comes, there's going to be this magic sludge that just happens to appear in the electrolytic fluid that's caused from the heavy recharge from the electrolysis process. And so now around these, especially these major city areas, which is, we know that these city areas are on the ley line points. And what are the ley line points? The ley line points are the energetic strong points in the crystal bridge. That's in the earth, the crystals that are running that. So that's going to be where your heavy negative charges are flowing. And that's where most of that energy during that is going to crash into. And it's also where that sludge is going to try and push its way into. And so now we've got a mud flood of just magic sludge that just appears, and you don't really have a good answer for it. Not yet, anyways. I've got a couple good theories, or one good theory on it. But to all practical purposes, magic sludge is just going to appear after everything organic gets vaporized because of a heavy electrical charge in order to recharge the battery.
Oh,
And
wow.
then,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Mind blown. Psh. Yeah. It's when we say mud flood, maybe some people don't understand what we're talking about. And so let's just touch on that because, it's something that I find absolutely fascinating. And we see evidence of it, photographic evidence of it, in a lot of locations around the whole plain, right? So,
yeah.
kind of give us a little background on what you mean by mud flood, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about Tartaria and that kind of thing, previous civilizations, and all of that too.
Well, and the funny thing is I really wasn't particularly into the mud flood at all. I didn't have any reasonable explanation, and I wasn't looking for one. Uh, I just happened on upon that, and I'm like, hold on, that's when you start looking at everything, and so I wasn't even a mud flood guy at all. But when you look at the mud floods, so what you have is around the world we have these major cities. And one of the other key factors you notice around these mud flood areas is the buildings are typically stone. And so these cities, 100 years ago, even, we have pictures where a couple different oddities are happening. This giant major metropolis, and there's basically no people in it. Where if you go down to San Francisco at any time of the day or night, LA, New York, and you take a picture, the odds of you getting a picture with no people in it are somewhere around the odds of you winning the lottery 5 times in a row. Yeah,
Right.
just zero.
Zero.
Um, so that they can take these pictures and have them with no, and the streets don't have like horse crap laying around in it. None of the things you would expect out of a lived in city. The other oddity that you notice is that the first floor, and sometimes even more, sometimes only partially the first floor of these buildings, there's a layer of dirt that's just completely saturated across the entire city. And it's almost like they built the city and it was all of a sudden there's 8, 10, 12 extra feet of dirt. as opposed to where they originally built it, where the ground foundation would have been. These things aren't basements, and they aren't even built like basements. They have full-sized windows, and then the ground level is above the window, and you're like, well, why would you do that? That doesn't even make any sense.
Right.
Um,
It makes no sense.
uh, None. And so, like I said, you put those things together, and I find them very interesting and very strange, but it's not something I had answer for and wasn't looking for one. It's just wasn't really on my radar. And I was talking to Chance Garton from Interverse, and I was explaining the Brown's gas machine. And at the same time, he's talking to me about the cosmic egg from his perspective and how it keeps growing. The landmass keeps growing, and that actually fits in with a lot of different occult things, where you take like the Theosophical Society, where they had the different generations of men, and land just seemed to get more and more. Where's this extra land coming from? Well, what it would be is, again, every time that battery recharges, and every time we go through the electrolysis side, all of a sudden this magic extra mass is going to appear in the electrolytic fluid. Now, what I think is it's actually seepage. It's pulling those ions out of the air, is what I think's happening. And wherever there's a heavy negative charge, because in that salt bridge is riding your negative charge, and that negative piece wants to be with its positive piece because it's negative. Everything in the universe wants to find that balance. So if this thing's negative, it wants to go back to zero. And there's something positive floating around up here that wants to go back to zero. So I think sometimes the negative side of things, instead of riding through the bridge and jumping back up where it was supposed to be, some of it slips out, because we know that conductors, they have, if you feel heat, radiation, any of that is energetic loss. And even though it's a smaller portion of the energy, a tiny little portion, that stuff adds up real quick. And especially if we're talking about a giant electrolysis event like this, there's going to be so much of it that's all going to jump out in a real quick hurry. And then the other real interesting thing about the electrolysis event is, I've always seen stories and heard stories about how Saturn was at one point in time the sun.
Yeah,
Which
that's
did
pretty
not.
common out there. Yep.
Yep. It didn't make any sense to me. Absolutely not. But the thing is in this battery system, Saturn as lead is the most anodic piece. That means it's the most subject to degradation. It's the crappiest one. It's going to fall apart the easiest, as opposed to the cathode in the galvanic cell, which is going to be the most stable, which is gold. Gold doesn't tarnish, it doesn't oxidize, it doesn't fall apart. Now, when you turn that around and go into the electrolysis process, the thing that was the cathode becomes the anode, and the anode becomes the cathode. So Saturn would literally become the sun during this energetic transfer, which is a reversal where the battery's getting charged back up. Now,
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
for
yeah.
this, then, right. So it's all it literally is that the energy is transferring into another direction. So then when we look at like the Vedas, they've got a deadline right here, and this is a golden age, and this is a golden age when you look at it. So you got a deadline, and then this is half of a golden age, and it's split. The golden age is split with this line. Then it moves down here into your other ages, into your silver, bronze, and then you get into your Kali Yuga right here.
Well,
And the Kali Yuga is
that's where we're at right
also
now, right?
split. Right, where the battery is basically dead. So if we look at this, when we're looking at it in this split, this side could be galvanic, and then this side is electrolysis. So if the battery is absolutely charged, then we're in the golden time, even when the battery's wearing away. Well, let's make this side the galvanic and this side the electrolysis, because I'm looking at it backwards. But so the battery's charged right here, perfectly charged. Well, the battery starts wearing away. We're still in the gold time though. All the electronics still work right. Everything's still good. My drills still rip the nuts off a rhino. Um, then we get down into this silver time. Batteries wearing away. Things aren't quite so good, but still mostly pretty good. Things still function. We start getting down here into the Kali Yuga. All of a sudden, battery doesn't work worth a crap. Nothing works right. So now we need to flip the switch. Right here's where the switch flips both times. Now we go into the electrolysis process. So here the battery's still kind of dead, getting better, getting better. Oh, full battery, full battery. Now we're back into the golden time. So we would remember the Saturn as being this awesome time of golden time because during this is the electrolysis where Saturn's the sun. Now here we flip the switch again, and then we have the 3 days of darkness that occurs in every one of these cosmologies because we're moving from an electrolysis reaction to a galvanic reaction. And that galvanic reaction requires chemical transfers, and that takes a few days to build up. So we've got your 3 days of darkness. Now, as a heathen, the original sun and moon had tails. The original sun and moon were chased by wolves, and those wolves eventually catch the sun and the moon and eat them. And when the sun and moon come back 3 days later, there's no wolves chasing them. What we had was the electrolysis process, and the cathode and the electrode were breaking apart because energy was being shoved into them, as opposed to the galvanic process where it's a chemical process is going backwards and everything's being sent to them. Entirely different process. And again, we have that switch being flipped. And we're about to be, I think, I don't know. And again, we're talking about a world model. So it could feel like it's really close for the next 200 years. We don't know.
So
Um,
there's really no way for us to kind of put a timeline on this and say, you know, this is how many years it is, and this is how
no,
many years since the last one, and all that kind of thing, right?
no, it would be nearly impossible. I mean, you would have to have lived out the entirety of one of these in order. It's no different than me living in this house. Well, what are the seasons like? I don't know. I have to live through all of them. And that's what we would have with these different yuga ages, is the different seasons also. And again, this golden age, which is big, this is just the battery being full, which when it's getting charged up, it's going to be full here, and then it's going to be depleting here. But through this entire part, it's going to be pretty good, pretty nice. And we're going to always remember that Saturn, that was a good time when Saturn was around, because the time when it was bad and Saturn was the sun, that was a really long time ago.
Yeah.
That was a very long time ago.
That makes so much sense. And then one thing I'd like you to relate to us too is that, and you mentioned it a few times about the mythologies and how these mythologies that we've always heard about, and there's several, there's a Greek mythology, there's the Norse mythology, there's all these different ones. And I know that you are extremely knowledgeable in, I guess, would you call it Odin mythology, or is
Yep.
it Norse mythology?
It's a Norse Germanic cosmology. Yep.
Yeah, but let's talk about how that is. It's really more metaphoric, right? For what we're talking about, than a lot of people take it more along the lines of actual entities, and they, I guess, in some way, they are entities. But
Right.
let's relate how that fits in with this whole cycle and the system that we're in, and what you're talking about when you refer to, you know, this so-called mythology, which is actually telling us the truth about what we're in, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So one of the things, and this is part of why I became an Odinist. Well, first I want to kind of address the part where we can't see these entities and we don't really know how to describe them. Well, the funny thing about that galvanic cell is when that particle that broke off from the anode split.
Uh-oh. I lost you there, Ben. I don't know if you can still hear me, but I lost you there for a minute.
and it split into an electron, and that electron went down into the electron. For all practical purposes, has moved down into the crystal. Should we pause for a second? Are you hearing me good? It
I
said
can hear you
connections
good
unstable.
now. You're back. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep. Okay. So when this particle split apart, it became an electron and an ion. Before it became an electron and an ion, which is their terminology, not mine. I think it's pretty misdescribed, but it became a negative side and a positive side. When it was a whole particle, we could easily pick it up, hold it, touch it, smell it, taste it. As soon as I split that particle into the two sides, I can't touch an electron. I can't weigh it. I can't smell it. I can't see it. I also can't do that with an ion. There's ions floating all over in the air around you, and you never know it. So when we're talking about the carbon plane is where these things are put together. And that's what we understand. Um, when as soon as they're split apart, we don't really understand them anymore. We can't process that. The ion is too energetic, too positive for us to understand. The electron is too negative, side is too negative for us to understand. We only understand this middle plane. That's the only thing our senses really register. Now, when you look at heathen cosmology, it's this all falls into place nicely too with the creation story. So our creation story, the world started out with three things. So you had Gununga Gap, which is just the great yawning chasm. It's just a void. This is the feminine. This is the all mother. Then you had another world, and this is half of the masculine. So this is Muspelheim, and then this is Niflheim. Now, when it started out, Muspelheim and Niflheim were not touching each other like that. They were apart, and there was no life. There was Muspelheim, there was Niflheim, and there was Gununga Gap. But Gununga Gap, the great yawning chasm, pulls Muspelheim and Niflheim together. And where those two meet, that's where life appears. Now, Muspelheim was the fire world, and nothing can take root in fire. Everything constantly changes. Fire is pure life. We're talking about pure energy on this level, energy in its most pure form. On the other side, Niflheim is the ice world, and nothing can grow in ice. Nothing can expand. Nothing can move. So this is pure structure. This is structuring at its epitome, as opposed to chaos at its epitome. And these two sides are both what is altogether the all father. Now, then the feminine side, or the all mother, pulls these two together, and the 9 worlds are the different layers of where they met. So you're going to have your Vesca Pisces, and inside the Vesca Pisces, the carbon plane, we're a little happy wizard dude right there. That's yeah, he's happy. He's going to stand right there in the center, and this is our cosmic egg. And everything up here is too much air for us, too chaotic, and down here is too dense. And this is where we live and where life starts happening. So everything under here, we're going to have 4 levels underneath here, dun, 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 and 4 levels above, because we have 9 worlds. We live on Midgard, the middle plane, the carbon plane.
So when you talk about the levels, this is something that I always wondered about. Are these frequency realms, or are we talking about physical elevation of the stratum or the realm? Are we talking about, like, if we were able to dig down far enough, we'd be in these other lower realms, and if we were able to blast off, in some kind of a plasma driven craft, we could go up to these other worlds? Or how does that work?
Okay. So as with so many things with the Abrahamic order that has come in, everything became solar and everything became one-sided. including our understanding of the four elements. And I have a severe problem with the four elements. Now, the story of the four elements, which is going to be these four levels or these four planes, is that fire met water and the two together made air. Makes sense so far. Now, then the three of them coagulate into earth, which makes absolutely no sense. And you just really lose me there. Now, when we look at it, we're going to go back to this earth plane and we're going to make that a zero. That's going to be your zero level. And then you're going to move up here and you're going to have water, and water's going to be a 1. And then we're going to have air, and air is going to be a 2. And then we're going to have the sun, which is fire. And that's going to be a 3. So what we have is above the carbon plane, we have 3 levels of chaos. Now, underneath the carbon plane, we also have the crystal planes. And when we look at crystals, you've got a botryoidal crystal, which is just kind of a clump of crystal material. It's pretty pure, but it's not really pure. And that's going to be a -1. And then we're going to look here and we're going to have us a plutonic solid. And that's where crystalline material is so perfectly aligned and so pure and so structured that it actually forms a solid. And you can look up the plutonic solids, and it does that without anything touching it, without any man cutting those edges. You can get some that are just amazingly sharp and look like something that it should have taken a professional jeweler years to figure out how to do and make. And that's something that came right out of the ground that way, because that is so perfectly aligned and structured that it has reached a plutonic solid level. That's a -2. Then we keep going down to our -3, and we have what we call a superconductor. Now, the way a normal conductor works is you put an electron in one side, and it goes toot, 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 and keeps bumping other electrons out of until another one falls out the other end. So it's basically like having a full glass that somehow the bottom falls out when you put one more drop into it, and that drop comes out the bottom. It's really inefficient. You lose a lot in heat. It takes time. Now, with a superconductor, as opposed to a normal conductor, a superconductor, all them particles are so perfectly aligned and so tight that something that exists on this side instantly also exists on this side. There's no transference between there. It just somehow exists on both sides. That's how structured these things are. Now, the funny thing about that is a superconductor will lock and sit over top of a magnetic field. So all this energy going through this conductor or going through this salt bridge is putting out a field, and that's going to end up locking us onto the magnetic field, the torus field that we sit around, where they talk about some cosmologists talk about where the earth shifted once, and we would be subject to quantum lock because we literally are sitting on top of a superconductor. And then the other interesting thing when you're looking at that, because should always match nature, is when you're going up, this is all getting hotter. And you're talking about plasma level. Then when you go down and you're getting more structured, to make a superconductor, when you're going down and you're getting more structured, in order to make a superconductor, and you can look that up, they have to freeze it. And they usually freeze it with like nitrogen or something like that in order to make it into a superconductor. So the more energetic you want something to be, the hotter you're talking about, the higher the energy, the more extra electrons, the way that's working. Well, then on the cold side, things become more structured and more conductive, able to carry that energy. And so now we see that we've just got entirely this whole beautiful system where this whole thing is just flowing, absolutely just flowing the entire time. And we can see that and match it up to like even the human cycles, where when the moon degrades, the moon only degrades when it's in its full moon state, because is when it's new moon, the silver particles aren't bound together anymore. This is one of the most interesting parts of the whole thing. So when the energy from the sun, not the light from the sun, but the radiation that comes off of the sun, hits these silver particles of the silver will actually soak in radiation. And then that radiation forms bonds in between these silver particles. And it will end up looking like one solid mass rather than a bunch of tiny little particles. It'll just start looking like one big glob. And then when that silver releases those energy bonds, it releases it as luminescence. So where most of the luminaries up there you look at them, all they are is a light. You don't really see anything particularly solid. Silver will soak this in and actually become solid. Well, now that it's a big solid instead of individual little particles, it's subject to that degradation. And that's when the particles will start splitting and breaking off, and it'll start losing pieces of itself. And then those pieces go over. First, the electron goes over and impregnates the sun. And during this gestation period, it pulls the ion over to itself. And now we've got the baby that is able to be released out to the world, which is what we call Ostara energy, or your early spring energy, your early morning energy, where like that early spring sun specifically, you went and collected the dew, the golden dew from that, because that was a very specific time. That's when the sun was giving out this radiant energy. And that radiant energy, just like every man, you wake up with morning wood, that radiant energy would then, yeah, absolutely. Just like the women would expose their genitals to the moon in order to ensure conception, that sun is giving us all morning wood, isn't it? And you know what? You're an older man, just like I am, Jimmy. I pee 3-4 times a night. I don't know. I wake up one time with morning wood. One time. I don't wake up at 3 in the morning with it. I wake up at about 6. That's when the sun's coming up.
That's it.
That energy affects us just like the moon affects women so greatly, because the sun is feminine and it's affecting men. The moon is masculine, it's affecting women. Well, this entire cycle of pregnancy and life is happening between the sun and the moon. And we see the same interaction between men and women, where the man actually ejaculates into the woman. And then this fusion happens, and this fusion creates something that's greater than either of the two pieces that got put into it. There's this like extra, just giant chunk of energy that happens with that fusion. And now we have a whole new little life that comes out. That's its own person. That's just amazing.
Yeah, that the whole concept is so amazing, and the cycles that we have of we see the sky clock going around the sun, and let's talk about that way that cosmology works, because basically the sky is in fact a clock that shows us a year goes by when the entire cycle goes around.
Yep.
The days of the week, let's talk about those cycles and how they're measured in our sky clock.
Which also is very interesting. Here's another thing that's very interesting when you're looking at, as you're referring to it as a sky clock. That's what all the stories referred to it as. It's only with this newer cosmologies that we have that all of a sudden the sun became God. Yeah. And that's a very odd thing. Like when you look at heathen cosmology, the sun and the moon were put into the sky to tell time. It's literally in our stories that's what the sun and the moon are doing. They aren't a head god. And typically in any of the old cosmologies, neither the sun or the moon are even one of the big gods. Like in heathen cosmology, the sun and the moon are children. They're Sol and Mani, and nobody's even ever heard of Sol and Mani. Everybody's heard of Odin, everybody's heard of Thor, everybody's heard of Loki, and none of them are the sun or the moon. When you look at Greek, Apollo specifically is the moon. He's not even in many of the stories. He just kind of rides around in a chariot being a jackass. Like he doesn't even do anything. Like, he's not Zeus, he's not Poseidon, he's not Hades, he's none of the main characters. He's just the sun. And so it's very interesting that we've now turned that into a god in and of itself, and given that so much power. Not to say that it doesn't have power and that it's not, providing so much to us, but that we've now turned that into the prime deity really is an interesting thing when you take it into the entire context of things. It really is interesting because when you look at it, then the moon is actually powering the sun, and is what gave the sun that power to give out to everybody else. So the moon was equal into that whole thing. And then furthermore, the plates would all fit into that. Now, so then when you're looking at the sun and the moon and the luminaries as timepieces, then you understand that certain things have to happen in certain cycles. And energetically, certain things are going to happen at certain cycles. Like we were just talking about, where with the sun and the moon do this entire exchange, and where the sun is now releasing this Ostara energy in the morning or in the spring for us, and we're gaining this extra special charge. Well, also along with that, when we look, the morning light or the spring light is orangish yellow, where the midday light is going to be this harsh blue light. And things work different in that harsh blue light than they do in that yellow light. When you're looking at spring plants, everything changes consistently. You walk out every day, the plants look entirely different than they did yesterday. They've got new sets of leaves. They're doing things you didn't even know they would do. Where come summer, the plant pretty much stays the same. It just gets to be a bigger version of what it was at the end of spring. Well, then in the fall, again, we're going to switch over to this orangish light again instead of this bluish light. And in this orangish light, we're going to have chaos again, because now the feminine's going to come back into the whole process. And with that, the plants are going to start fruiting. They're going to start flowering. We're going to start seeing change along with that growth again. It's not just an even, steady growth. There's actual chaos and change involved into that. And then we end up moving into the winter time, where the sun changes into a white light. And that white light is more of a dead negative light. And you don't have growth. You actually have a destruction process that's going to happen with that. Now, oppositionally, you have the way the moon is working with the sun. And we see when the moon, the full moon is always opposite. And we see the way these are working around. Well, we're seeing these exchanges. And just like I was talking about, where sometimes the mercurial solution is stealing away energy from this side, and you would consider that a negative, bad thing. And over here, it's being benevolent because it's giving things. You understand that each of these luminaries is going to interact with each other in that way also then. So depending on whether Mars is in its positive aspect, where it's giving this energy in a certain direction, then you're getting this positive charge, and you're going to get the things that iron has, like iron in your body specifically. When you're looking at the iron and copper, and that's the other interesting thing, is that these planets all seem to pair up, and in your body they do the same thing. So when you're looking at Mars, Venus, and everybody's like, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, blah blah blah. Right. So Mars is iron and Venus is copper. Well, another thing that you see, rather than the men are from Mars, women are from Venus BS, the thing in the truther world that they talk about is some people have blue blood and some people have red blood. And all of this is just nonsense, right? So when you look at your blood, your iron blood is your red blood, and the iron draws in oxygen. And then your copper is your blue blood, which everybody also has. And because copper turns everything around it blue. And then the copper blood actually pushes that oxygen out, back out. And so what we have is that oxygen needs to be able to circulate through your system. And that's why your blood's carrying it to these places. It needs to be able to make its way into and out of your muscles, because what needs to go in there in order to grab away those little pieces of carbon so your muscle can convert glucose into ATP and become energy for strength. But then that needs to get back out and get out of your system. So that needs to get back into your bloodstream and carry itself on out and get pushed clean out. And so we have an entire series and processes of events where this is happening in the body. Well, the same thing is going on in the sky, where we need oxygen on this to make the moon break down and oxygenate and oxidize the moon and carry over those particles, those positive ions, and let them negative ions release in order for the sun to do its part, which needs to be done with hydrogen. And this whole thing just needs to just keep going through this entire process. Now, through that, if you happen to have LC King on, he's better about speaking about, because he's been looking at like when you're looking at these processes then. And there's another gentleman, I can't think of his name. He's talking about like where water's made around mountaintops and things like that. Well, you look, the ocean floor, the volcanoes, things like that, they're just pumping up tons of sulfur, tons of mercury, tons of this stuff up into the atmosphere, where it's all doing all these interchangings, and all of this is taking place so we can all just live on a daily basis. It's really just mind-boggling and amazing in its entirety, but at the same time, it's kind of simple.
It is. And when you break it down that way, as our system is a giant battery, it makes so much sense. It really does. And those interactions. One thing I want to try and relate to in our current situation, of course, the evil archy has risen its ugly heads everywhere now, where it used to be more occult or more hidden. It's always been there. We've always been controlled and manipulated through, as far back as we can imagine in our fake history, that this stuff has been going on. But now it's totally out in the open. I mean, it's everywhere. Unless you're, like a lot of people are still vast asleep, and you could slap in the face and they still wouldn't understand what they're seeing or hearing. But
Yep.
those of us who are paying attention, the evil archy has risen up and said, hey, here we are. This is what we're going to do to you. This is what we're now doing to you. And this is what we're going to do to you in the future. And, we run the show. So we refer to this as a war of good and evil, and in a spiritual sense. So let's relate what's happening currently now in that spiritual sense as us experiencing on this plane of existence, this carbon plane that you're referring to. Let's talk about that.
Right. So first, let's understand that as a being of the carbon plane, we're the zero. That's where we're supposed to be. We're not supposed to be thinking that -3 is great, nor are we supposed to think that +3 is great. We think 0 is great because that's where we live. That's where life happens. Now, the +3 and -3, they're all just fine. They're great. And they are helping make life happen, but they're not something we're trying to achieve to, because if you move to and stay on either side, that's death. Now, what's going on is just like in the battery, is this brings us back to the solar cult, is sulfation. Now, what happens when a battery starts wearing out and things start going sideways is the battery is actually losing polarity, where this sun side, this +3, and this crystal side, this -3, this +3 and this -3, they're actually the same thing. And they've been split and polarized just like a magnet. And that's how you gained power. When they come back together, then you're going to lose that unless it's done through the alchemical marriage. Now, this isn't happening. What we're getting instead is called sulfation. And sulfation is where the crystals will actually come up and start attaching to the plates, and we lose all of our differential. We lose all of our polarity. And when we look at what's going on, a sulfur is being dumped into the environment by the mad gab. We're running out of the energy, and we've moved into this weird solar cult where that is the only thing that we understand. And we've lost this differential. The funny thing about it is, whether it's the liberals or the Democrats, for most of us, we can't tell the difference anymore. Or the liberals and the Republicans, whatever. The two sides, the Republicans, Democrats, the red, the blue, most of us can't tell the difference. They're both extraordinarily fascist. They're both trying to censor everybody. They're both all about stealing your money. They're both all about corruption. There is no differential anymore. Before this, and part of what brought us to this is understanding that 100 years ago or 80 years ago, or at some point in time in the past, there actually was a meaningful difference between Republicans and Democrats. That one side had one goal, and the other side was in opposition to that. Where now both sides just want to get rich and screw you, and that whole differential is gone, you know. And this is the system breaking down. As I was explaining before, anytime you want power, you have to have this polarity. You have to have light. If you're talking about an earth battery, with an earth battery, you dig an electrode deep into the earth where it stays really cold. And then you put another electrode on the top, and where the sun's going to hit it and it gets hot. And just that difference in temperature alone will create voltage and amperage and energy. Just that differential. That's always the case, is this differential. Now, as we're looking at the end of this cycle, and as it comes, the crystals are starting to sulfate to the top of the battery, and we're seeing that everything always works on the same on all levels, as above, so below. So as that's happening on the universal or the world level, it's happening to us as a people too. We are becoming homogenized as a people. You can't tell the difference between boys and girls right now. All the time, I see things that clips that they've played on TV that somebody's showing, and I'm like, what is that? Is it, and I don't really care, but just that I can't figure it out is an
Right.
odd thing. We've lost our polarization. Our battery is becoming deplete and dead. And with that, we're one-sided. We're polarized. We don't have the difference. We needed that difference in order to even have something to do. And that's why we started out with two different political parties. So if we don't like what this one's doing, we can go to this side, and that side will answer what this side's doing. And it balances the whole equation out. Now that equation isn't really even existing. And we've just got this weird solar cult, and everything, as the battery winds down, moves to the cathode. Everything moves to that cathode, and then until the whole system breaks down and it all floods back. But what we have is then the solar cults that have taken and risen to power. We have the cathode that's done that, and we've lost all of our polarization and power. And now we've become these tiny little people that are weak. Wow, is it just shocking? Like, now, when you're looking at the mud floods and things like that, where they talk about how these things were built in these tiny, tiny amounts of time, that's one of the points of contention that they have that I actually don't question near as much as they do. Because you watch how things are built and how people work today. And even myself, 20 years ago, and granted, part of this is just age, but 20 years ago, the amount of work I could accomplish in a day was jaw dropping. I literally, my junior and senior year, my junior year of high school, I got my high school sweetheart pregnant. And my dad, and we ended up getting married and all that, and having multiple kids and all that. But my parents didn't pay for that. And I worked two jobs and went to high school. and I was throwing 50 and 100-pound bags for 8 hours, and going home and still doing my home chores and just working like you wouldn't believe. And I see kids nowadays, they can't work for 2 hours straight.
That's true.
They do. Yeah, it's amazing. And when you take that into perspective, the amount a person was able to get done 100 years ago, or even when I was a kid, was shockingly more than it is now. We're just, as a society, losing our power and losing our energy. As a people, everybody's walking around scugging energy drinks like mad, even though they don't really do anything. They just sit there all day. They aren't burning up energy. I go out and I run up and down the mountain all day and chop wood and chase animals and do whatever. And I don't drink coffee or any kind of caffeine or anything like that.
So,
Like,
how do you explain us? Okay, you and me and the people that can see what's actually, we can perceive a large amount. Well, I don't even know how much we actually perceive, but we can perceive more than a lot of people do. And we have this group of people, which I would say are in the majority right now, who are just lost. They are programmed by by the evil archy. They're in a world which is completely fake and programmed and designed to keep them as dutiful slaves, right? But then you have
yeah,
people like us who can actually perceive that this is what's happening, that that this world is programmed, this fake media world that we have around us, uh, mainly through the media, is programming us into little drones, little slave drones. So why is that there's certain of us who can see that, and there's certain of us, no matter how hard you try to explain it to them, they just can't grasp it?
it's the oxycarbylation of the pineal gland, the decarbylation of the pineal gland. So when you're looking at your body, just like with the world where we had the three levels of pluses, and just like when we were talking about plants, well, the thing about that is again, when you get to that third level of plant, the oil is actually locked up with carbon, and the same is going to apply with you. And the only way to get that out is through fire. So most of us that are awake have at some point in time had some real shitty lives. Like, that's just across the board. Like, the world did not work for us. And what's going on is just like with that cannabis plant, where I had to actually put it to 170-degree fire for long enough for that carbon molecule to break off in order and fly away, in order for the THC to be able to bond with me. The same thing applies to you. Now, the thing about the THC is, then, when you're looking at plant alchemy in a whole, rather than just taking the THC and putting it in you, now that it's been decarbonized, what that's really meant to do is that supposed to open up the salt. So you take and you remove your three levels of oil in the plant, but you also remove your three levels of salt in the plant, the three levels of structuring, just like the world model I was talking about, just like the elemental world levels I was talking about. So this +3 of oil or fire, it's meant to open up this -3 of salt. These two go together, these two go together, these go together. So just like with the planets and the way the planets want to pair off, the way everything wants to pair off into a positive and negative. And so when you're looking at the high mind, that's your oil mind, that's your plus mind. Now, when you go through a real hard time and some real hard life, then that's when you're talking about, and that's what wakes most of us up, is opening that up. And now we can see. Now the world is open. And this is Odin. When Odin sat and became the high god, he sent out Yugen and Munin, which is thought and memory, and he sent them through the whole world. and had them bring everything back to him. And he had all the knowledge of the world. And that's what we're talking about up here is your high mind and opening that up to all this high knowledge. But where the community needs to go next is what Odin did. He went to Mimir's well and he threw that eye down the well to open up his lowest salt so he can get at his ancestral wisdom. Because knowledge is great, but it doesn't do a lot without wisdom. Knowing doesn't mean it, you don't really, that book knowledge, it's very little use until you actually take and match it up to the world. And that's where you get your wisdom from. You're opening up your salt mind. And when you put those two things together, now you've got your voltage and your amperage, and you're really moving. You've got power. And that's what we need to do is take this knowledge, and we need to be like Marty Leeds, who just went up into upper Wisconsin and bought himself an off-grid place, and him and his wife are busting their ass to get that all ready and showering off of a solar bag and foraging for food. We need to be like Owen Benjamin, who's up in Idaho and has developed the Great Bear Trail and Beartaria. And he's having people come in and teaching them how to live off grid, and has an entire community that's doing bartering with each other and helping each other out. And it's absolutely beautiful. We need to start actually taking these things, not being the ones that sit around talking about waking people up, but actually going out and taking this knowledge and using it for ourselves. Because that's when people are going to wake up, because they're going to go, that's funny because he lives like that. You tell me it doesn't work, but I see him doing it. That's when you become believable. And that's what we need to move into. We've got so many people that have woken up now, and it's so beautiful. Now we need to take that knowledge and build our own world. Fuck their world. Who gives a shit? I don't care about Nancy Pelosi or drunk ass. Build back better. I just love saying it. Like, nobody cares about that. Nobody cares about Donald Trump. Let him go on WWF. I don't watch WWF. I don't watch TV. It's the only reason these people have power is because you have given it to them. Once we start building lives that aren't theirs, they lose control. They lose their power. And the more of us that go out and start living that, the more other people are going to go, well, yeah, but that dude's not wearing a mask and he seems happy and he's smiling and looks in shape. And what the fuck?
Yeah. Yeah, lead by example and be out there. Yeah,
Yep.
and you're doing it. You are already doing it. You're putting your wisdom to good use. You're off grid. You're self sufficient. And you're right. This is sort of leading us back to what we would consider more tribal way of living, right?
Absolutely. And that's really the fight that we're going through right now. And it's a fight that we've always went through and always will go through. And that fight was most easily explained with, most people know, the Prometheus story, where we had gods and we had men. And then Prometheus gave free will to men, or your own free will, your own thoughts, your own life, your own goals. You don't have to be subject to what somebody else tells you. Now, since that happened, half of humanity wants to give it back, and always has. They approximately, and that oscillates back and forth, because in the tribal society, we're talking about independent people who want to make their own decisions, hate being told what to do. And like the Germanic historian Tacitus, or the Roman historian Tacitus, when he came upon the Germanic people, he's like, they barely hang out with each other. They don't even like, these people live in villages and only get together once a week. They don't even associate with each other hardly. This is weird. He took it as not liking each other even. And that's not how we feel about it. We're just an independent lot. And that's opposed to civilization, where everything's about giving your authority up to the next ruler. It doesn't matter whether that's your apartment building manager, whether it's the crosswalk guy, the street guy here, the person in the store telling you what to do, the senator, the school board, the Jesus Christ. I don't care what it is. If you have a question, there's somebody that's got a rule. Can I do this? If you actually bother asking, there is a rule from some ruler that will tell you you cannot. Everything in life. It's amazing. And I just don't ask because I'm not subject to your rules. Why would I bother asking? As soon as I go looking for those rules, they're there. They're there to be found, I promise. But I'm not subject to them because I have my free will. Well, we're just in a time in the cycle now where most people don't want that. Most people would rather be into civilization. They don't want the responsibility of free will. They don't want the all that comes with it. Every single day on my farm, if my water goes out, Ben has to go out and fix it. My electricity goes out. Ben's got to figure out what happened and go fix it. If there's an animal down here at the problem, Ben fixes it. If the flood, every time that is the answer. Ben fixes it every time. Well,
Mhm.
most people don't want that, and they don't want the insecurity that comes with that. Like some days, like last week, it was a mountain lion, down hanging out on my property, threatening my animals. Then it's the damn water pump goes out, or the electricity goes out, or I need to go take one of the cows has got something in its hoof. So many different things. I don't just go to work, and that's what people want. I just want to go to work. I want to push my little button. I'll push my button until the clock tells me I'm done pushing the button. And then I'll go home and I'll sit down and I'll push a button for a little bit and till it's time to go to bed. And then I'll go home to bed and wait. And they can't even get up on their own. They need an alarm to tell them to get up. Like that's the start of most people's day, is an alarm telling them what to do.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, we've been herded. We've been herded big time into these mind boxes, and there's no doubt about that. But we're talking about cycles here. So there's one other thing I wanted to ask you about before we go, because we're all curious about cycles of life. Okay, we come into, we are spirit beings. We're
Mhm.
divinity coming into these physical, amazing creations called a body. But we're only here for a limited amount of our perceived time. So where
Yep.
do we go in between? And then how do we decide, are we going to come back? Are we going to go somewhere? Are there other completely different realms that we can experience in? I would think so. But, where do we go when we leave these physical
So,
bodies?
so let's look at a plant, and the same thing's going to happen to you. If a plant dies out in the field, it's going to fall down, and the first thing that's going to happen is the water's going to evaporate out. And the water belongs to this earth. It's going to go back to the earth. Then one of your important pieces is going to leave, is one of the important pieces is going to leave, which is the oil. Now the oil, which is bearing the sulfur, is going to rise up and vaporize off and go floating away. That's going to go up. And we're again at zero line where that dead body is. Now, the carbon is also going to evaporate off and wear away. Also belongs to the earth. So that's going to go back to the earth. And everything that's organic, we're going to find that water and that carbon and some cellular material that holds the water and the carbon. Those are the three things that belong to the earth: the ash, the carbon, and the water. Now, once that carbon's released, though, and that ash, now the salt is going to get released, and the salt is going to go down because your two pieces, this salt and this oil, or oil bearing sulfur. So you're these two things. Now, the salt wants to go down, the oil wants to go up, and they're going to do that. But then eventually the oil cools off and drops back down and eventually meets with salt again, and they become life again. And we have more plants, and more plants get made out of it. Now, that salt, that got released a lot later than the oil. It sat there and degenerated for a very long time. So the spirit of something and the actual salt wisdom of it are not the exact same thing. And that spirit is going to, when it comes down, is going to find other salt, not the original salt that it was with. It's going to find other salt. and that salt's not going to be back for a while. And so this is why you end up losing your memories every time, because you're no longer the same salt and same oil. You failed. You didn't do the entire thing, because while this cycle works and we're all going to go through this cycle, we're all also supposed to be here to do the great work, which is what Odin taught us, which is what Yeshua taught us, Hermes taught us. Then you don't die. Then you become immortal. So in order to do that with the plant, I pull apart these pieces and I capture that salt and that oil, and I remove the carbon, the cellular material in the water, and I give those back to the earth. And them two pieces that wanted to go opposite, which were making an infinity of life, because one was going up and coming back down, one was going down, coming back up, and we have the infinity of life. Burp, burp, burp. Instead, I caught these two loops and I folded them back over and mushed them together into a zero and put them on the zero plane. So I took that +3 and I took that -3 and I smashed them together and made a zero. And now that loop doesn't happen anymore. It's one thing now. It's all the time. It's the entire +3. All the time. It's the entire -3. We don't have to have this carbon, this water, and this cellular material holding them together anymore, because they aren't opposite anymore. I've put them together in the proper way, the alchemical marriage, into the great work. This is why alchemically they say you die before you die, so you don't die.
So, what you're saying is, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that we can become literally immortal in our bodies if we master this cycle that you're talking about?
Yes, you are here to do that. That is the entire reason you're here, is to become not the all, not, you won't even become Odin, but to follow the same path that Odin took in order to become a god. You are here to become something more. Bring yourself up to the epitome of a human, and that is a god. This is why even in Jesus told you that you could move mountains. You have that ability. You have the ability to be a god. We are barely touching those abilities. We're just walking around like a little kid that never read the instructions, doing something like, or like me in one of this rental car that my friend had me drive, and I'm like, I know how to use one button, and that's what I will use. And there's like a million features in this thing that I have no idea how to touch, and I never will. Like, and that's us running around in our bodies. We've got a million features that we are not even touching, that we as a people have no reason to go through this in any way. We can literally just shape existence around us. When you're talking about the way Thoth talked about making the Great Pyramid, where he went up into the ion, the positive side, or the positive realm, or the high knowledge realm,
This the
and
plus
then
three we're
reach
talking about?
the +3. So he goes into the +3, and then he reaches down into the -3, or the structured material side, and he pulls it up to the zero level. Read the Emerald Tablets. That's exactly what he's saying he's doing. So it's always just taking, because that +3 and that -3 were always the same thing. But in order to get power or polarity, they had to split. And now you're putting them back together. And what is that same description? That battery that we were talking about, where we're splitting pieces and putting them back together and living off of the energy from that transmutation.
Wow, that is so awesome. It's it's
Yes.
it's mind expanding just to consider these things, right? So, are there beings in this realm that we can look to, point to, and say, "Hey, he's made it. He's followed Odin's path, and he's there. He's totally immortal." Is there anybody like that?
Well, they say that Saint Germain is the most famous that's supposed to be like that of recent times, where Saint Germain was just alive during the French. Stop. Was just alive during the French Revolution. They say that so he was trying to advise the king and queen, had advised them against, yes, I know, um, had advised them against the treatments of the common people and everything that was going on. Well, they didn't appreciate his counsel when he told them that, you guys are about, your country's about to go under, and they didn't appreciate that much. So they locked him in prison. Well, then from prison, when they went to go retrieve him, the only thing that they found was the Trina Sophia, and that's left by Saint Germain, and it's a basically an equivalent to the Emerald Tablet when you're reading it, where it's talking about the great work in a much more metaphoric type situation, where he talks about the 3 levels and what he had to do in each of those levels and things like that. And you have to understand that it's an achievement of the great work, or else it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not a beginner book by any means. And then they say that he lives in Mount Shasta out here, is one of the big legends about him. So they say that Saint Germain did that. And one of the things that, and this is also one of the things that you immediately understand is, okay, so when you were looking at the electrolysis process on that machine, that's driving transmutation. But the 2 elements that I'm putting into that is electricity, which is, again, the negative side of things. And the electricity is getting pushed through this electrode and then these plates. And what's appearing in the electrolytic fluid matches those plates and electrodes. So what I think is happening is the electron basically is getting programmed as it's going through those plates. It's programming it, and then it's automatically grabbing on to the positive ion that matches. So my theory, which I'm going to be making less of a theory real soon, it's either going to be completely shite or else it's going to be a fact, one or the other. So my theory is that it's programming the electron side. Well, then you understand that if you can program the negative side of the particle, and then it doesn't really matter, you can really make whatever you want at that point. You can just make things like, I want this. Oh, well, you're basically just programming the particle. So then at that point, then the next thing that you got to start looking at is where you see all the old alchemists start looking at actually making life, because making dead matter is dead matter. That's entirely different than giving it the gift of life, which that's what we're talking about, comes from God, comes from the All-Father, is that actual spark of life. So it doesn't take long to realize that this is really simple enough that as soon as somebody grasped it, they immediately jumped to, I'm going to start making homunculi and shit, because all you're doing is programming dead matter. And if it's that simple, you're nothing but basically a monkey at that point. You're just doing the same thing over and over.
Of course. Yeah. And that, I love thinking in these terms of creation and what is possible for us as beings here. It's so incredible, even though we're going through all this bullshit now with all of these bizarre entities that want to control and manipulate us. But, we have to rise above all of that, of course. But Ben, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us, this afternoon, and whatever time that any of you may be viewing this. It's been a pleasure as always. My mind is like, wow, I feel like I've expanded so much just having this conversation, and I totally appreciate you and respect you and admire you. So until next time, everybody, we'll see you inside the Matrix.